Over the last few decades, anti-sexual violence activism has shifted the focus of its messaging. Throughout the 1990s, the framework centered on the language of refusal. The prevailing message was that no means no, placing the responsibility on the listener to recognize and respect a partner's rejection. Modern campaigns have moved toward explicit affirmation. Slogans like "yes means yes" and high-visibility "get consent" marketing now dominate the landscape of campus activism. This pedagogical shift relies on a specific assumption held by the administrators and educators designing these programs. When institutions look at high rates of sexual violence, they conclude that young adults lack the basic skills to communicate effectively about sex. Because the problem is viewed as a communication deficit, the institutional solution is instructional. Programs are built specifically to teach people the mechanics of consenting. However, qualitative interviews with young adults regarding their sexual experiences tell a different story. The logic driving these campaigns appears misaligned with behavioral reality. When prompted to describe how they navigate sexual encounters, this target demographic describes a sophisticated system for communicating and interpreting mutual willingness. The reality is, they already possess these skills. The friction stems from a linguistic mismatch between the institutional definition of the word consent and the lived reality of how humans negotiate sex. By diagnosing the problem as a lack of skills rather than a failure of vocabulary, educators risk engineering prevention campaigns that solve for the wrong variables. To understand this mismatch, we must look at the foundational layer of how institutions understand sex. It is the strict legal framework of consent. From a legal standpoint, consent is not an abstract feeling. The law requires two distinct, non-negotiable components to be present for an act to be considered consensual. The first component is capacity. This evaluates the objective chronological and physiological state of the individuals involved. Capacity requires specific, measurable factors. They must be of legal age, they must be conscious, and below specific intoxication thresholds. The second component is the act of communication. This evaluates exactly how the agreement is granted by one party to another. The requirements for this communication vary by jurisdiction. In some regions, mere acquiescence, simply not fighting back, satisfies the legal requirement. In jurisdictions like Canada or New Zealand, the law dictates that consent can only exist in the provable absence of coercion. The law treats consent as a rigid, formal threshold. It is a binary checkbox. Capacity is either present or absent. While this works for assigning liability in a courtroom, it does not reflect the fluid nature of human interaction. Moving from the courtroom to the sociological reality of college campuses, we can observe how young adults actually interpret that specific word. When researchers ask young adults to define sexual consent, the participants view the term through a highly rigid, quasi-legal lens. Participants frequently describe consent as a formal minimum requirement. In many interviews, they reduce it to the simple absence as physical resistance, stating that consent exists as long as a partner doesn't say no or pull away. They also frequently define consent as a discrete, one-time event. Agreeing to go back to someone's apartment is often described as the singular moment where consent is established for the entire night. But the research exposes a pivot when interviewers stop asking about the word consent and instead ask these same young adults how they assess their partner's willingness to have sex. This diagram illustrates a clear dichotomy. When prompted with consent, responses fall into a static category.
Conversely, when discussing willingness, participants describe a dynamic, iterative process of continuous negotiation and mutual cue reading. Young adults instinctively strip legal jargon out of their actual sexual negotiations, treating consent as a technicality for policy and willingness as the operative language. To gauge this willingness, participants detail reading subtle shifts in body language throughout an encounter. They monitor subtle changes in breathing, momentary hesitations, and active physical participation to ensure their partner remains comfortable. By focusing on a static legal concept, educators are attempting to teach a vocabulary that doesn't map to the dynamic framework their audience actually uses. This semantic fracture also forces us to reevaluate data regarding gender differences in sexual communication. This bar chart shows the results of a prominent sociological study. The data indicates that men are statistically more likely to define consent as an isolated event, while women are more likely to define it as an ongoing process. Standard academic interpretations of this data often lead to a flawed conclusion. Researchers assume this means men believe they do not need to monitor a partner's ongoing willingness once a sexual encounter begins. The paradox is that researchers have confused the subject's rigid definition of the word with their actual behavior. A person can genuinely believe that consent is a one-time legal event granted the moment they entered the bedroom, while simultaneously engaging in the highly iterative process of checking their partner's willingness by continuously reading body language and physical cues. Young adults are not ignoring their partner's ongoing boundaries. They simply do not apply the label consent to that monitoring process. Applying this data to practical interventions reveals why traditional consent is sexy posters often fail to influence campus culture. Because the target audience maps consent to a minimum legal standard, centering prevention campaigns around that specific word creates a sense of detachment from real intimacy. Instead, we can look to the Sexual Assault Voices of Edmonton campaign, or SAVE, as a data-backed alternative to traditional messaging. The most critical feature of this campaign is a deliberate omission, the total absence of the word consent. This linguistic shift succeeds because it uses direct behavioral language. It maps exactly to how young adults already process the concept of willingness. The phrasing leaves zero room for multiple interpretations. It targets the exact behaviors involved in sexual negotiation, without requiring an understanding of complex legal definitions.
To create effective prevention strategies, activists must move away from the vocabulary of the courtroom and toward language that reflects behavior. This sociological data suggests a new approach for Title IX administrators and campus educators. Institutions need a bifurcated curriculum model. This model separates the instruction of legal parameters from the instruction of behavioral communication. This horizontal timeline graphic illustrates the first tier, short-form educational interventions. Brief settings like freshman orientation lectures should be utilized to target objective legal capacity. This is the space to deliver the hard rules about the age of consent, sobriety limits, and criminal liability. The second tier requires long-form educational programming. In these longer workshops, educators must abandon the focus on explicit legal consent. Instead, the curriculum should build upon the negotiation skills and nonverbal cue reading that young adults already utilize. By disentangling the legal baseline from lived behavior, educators can move past administrative compliance and guide young adults toward a culture of continuous, ethical erotics.